Hey guys, I'm Jeremy, and here's my story of my trip to Iraq. So it's funny because I was in the Army 4 years, and most people will ask, oh, were you in Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that? And I'm like, I've been to Iraq, but not in the Army. I was there as a bicyclist on a cycling tour. And so this was in 2009. So that next year, the American soldiers were starting to pull out, and this was about 3 years before ISIS took over. So there was still some bombings and dangers, but generally speaking, Kurdistan Iraq, which is where I was headed, is safer than the other parts of Iraq. It also has the highest mountains in the area of the country. Along the border of Iran and Turkey, you've got mountains up to like 11 or 12,000 feet, which is like 3,600 meters. So also some of the best scenery you could see if you like the mountains. And great hospitality. I think I was there like 9 or 10 days, and almost half of the nights I stayed with local people. So really good experience. So Kurdistan, Iraq is safer than most places in Iraq, although I was a little worried that the cab driver might kidnap me and bring me to Mosul, but that's a separate story. But yeah, this area didn't see too much of the fighting and things over the last, 15 years or so. The people in this area are the Kurds, and if you don't know who the Kurds are, they're probably one of the largest ethnic groups in the world to not actually have a country. So most of the Kurds are actually in eastern Turkey, which is almost 20% of the population there, and then a huge population in Iran, and then also in Iraq and Syria, and many more around the world. And so just because of some aspects of history, basically they didn't end up with a nation. They were part of Iran or Persia at some point, and generally speaking, the Persians treated them pretty good. Whereas, they still have many issues today with the Turks. And then later in Iraq, I don't know if you know the stories of one of the excuses for the Americans to go to Iraq was the treatment of the Kurds. In the late 80s, early 90s, Saddam gassed, thousands of people and stuff like that. So they've been, kind of on all sides fighting different people for many years, and unfortunately, they haven't ended up with their own country. So they have this autonomous region in northeast Iraq, and then many of the Kurds in eastern Turkey are still fighting the government there off and on for many years. So I started this bike trip in Armenia. I had already did Asia, the 2 or 3 years before. I'd gone home commercial fishing in Alaska, and then I came back to do this trip, which would include the Middle East, a little bit of Africa and South America. And so I went through Armenia and Georgia, which was great, and then I went through Turkey, which was pretty decent. Although I will admit, maybe I have a bias after living briefly in Armenia, but I wasn't a super big fan of Turkey. But anyway, I got to the border, and I knew there was some strange rule, like I couldn't just bike across like the bridge or the border area. There's maybe a mile or two, or that you have to actually like take a taxi or something. And so this one guy, Omar, who's from that region but lived in Germany, he was nice enough where he could like take my bike across in his trailer, but I couldn't be in his car because it was listed that it was like one passenger, so I was like still stuck taking the taxi. And I had to go like 2 minutes in a taxi ride to give him $10 or something. So it was a little annoying. But anyway, I crossed through and things were fine. And for Kurdistan, you could get 10 days automatically for Americans. And I think most tourists can. It's probably something similar now. And then I headed down that main road for a little bit, which would go down to Mosul, which I think is Route 2. And that road, of course, like any main road through a country, is super busy with trucks. And there's not really a shoulder. You just have like kind of the pebbles and rocks on the side there. So luckily that next day I'd taken a left and gone towards the long way to Erbil through the Kurd region next to the mountains, which wasn't too bad. But that first section for like 50 or 60 kilometers is a little busy. And that first evening, I guess I stopped. I had some pizza actually in a place, and then I actually just camped out on a hill there. And so the next day I went through Duhok, and that's where the road kind of turns off to the left towards the mountains. And that seemed like a cool little town. And then I continued on a bit, and there was some rain, and I always don't really like driving in the rain, not just because it's cold and wet, but I don't trust that the window wipers on the vehicles are great, and if there's not a great shoulder, it's not super safe. But I guess I had talked to some people in Duhok who mentioned there was like a hotel in like the next village, because I didn't want to stop in that town. It was too early. And I didn't see a hotel, but some local guys who didn't know good English took me in. So that was really cool. They had a real cute family. And I stayed there for the night. You know, I was watching like the Goodfellas and kind of hanging out there for a while. Had some of the local food and things. And yeah, really nice people. The next day I stopped in a Syrian village. So as I mentioned, you know, the big groups in this area in general in the Middle East would be like, you've got the Turks up here, the Armenians, Persians, and Arabs, okay? There's a pretty small ethnic group, the Assyrians, which is a small Christian group, which is probably only about a couple million people. So maybe in Iraq there's a couple 100,000 of them. You know, the Kurds are a pretty big group. They're like, you know, 40 million throughout that whole region. So anyway, they've suffered kind of like what the Armenians have gone through in history, where thousands of them at a time have been killed by, you know, whether they're Kurds or Arabs or, you know, Turks or whatever, you know, because they're just a very small Christian ethnic group, which they have a long history. I mean, they're one of the oldest in the regions, going back like thousands of years. But anyway, I actually met a guy who had worked, you know, probably with the Americans more on doing some intelligence or law enforcement stuff at some point. And it was interesting because he brought up the point that, you know, the Iraq war wasn't just about oil. And that's actually true, because, you know, it's not that it wasn't about making money. It was, you know, all of the arms manufacturers sold, you know, tons of different missiles and arms and helicopters and tanks and all that stuff. And then rebuilding Iraq, you know, telecommunications and things like that. But the ironic point, and you could even check on this, China actually ended up getting most of the oil out of Iraq, at least half. They were actually the first country to go in Iraq around just, I think, the year before I got there in 2008. And even now, under the Belt and Road Initiative, after all of the Americans spent that money and did everything, China got most of the oil. And it's not just because the Americans didn't want it, or the British or whoever. It's that the American or British companies have shareholders, and they have to decide basically like, the risk is too high for us to take it. Where China needed the oil, they were willing to take the risk. Even if they were to lose profit, it wasn't about the profit, it was just they wanted the oil, this kind of thing. So just economics basically, but quite ironic. His family also told me how, you know, things were much better way back before, like Saddam and some of those parties back in the 50s, which you could see this in Afghanistan and Lebanon. A lot of areas in the Middle East, like in the 50s or 60s, was actually pretty nice. And then Saddam had like bulldozed tons of their homes and things like that. They had like a much bigger compound, but it was destroyed. So needless to say, if you meet anyone in Kurdistan region, they're super happy the Americans were there. So despite what anyone says that it's all bad America going there, it definitely is quite good for some of the people, because they were, you know, quite an oppressed minority, the Kurds, the Assyrians, and other people in those areas. And even all the Arabs under Saddam in general, you know. So obviously in the short term it's a horrible thing, but maybe in the long run it's not as bad as maybe people think. So the next day I headed out towards Amedi. And that's basically an old city up kind of on a mesa. And they had like, I don't know, 10,000 people up there at different times in history. So obviously a good fortress, because you've got the, you know, the rocks that would be a great protection. So over the years, you know, different groups have taken over or whatever. But really pretty. And in general, that area before and after there, the next 2 or 3 days, was some of the nicest parts of the trip. Obviously at this time there wasn't hardly any tourists at all. I can't even remember if I even saw any tourists in general, but you would get a lot of people staring and stuff on this trip in general. So after I checked out that town, I was checking out actually like an abandoned hotel, and I'd seen a guy, and he basically invited me into his home, which was nice. You know, he had like I don't know, 3 or 4 sons and a couple daughters and stuff, and the extended family. And that was really nice. Once again, you can't really communicate too much, and it wasn't that late in the day, so you're kind of milling around a little bit and trying to communicate. Of course, I didn't have a good translator on my phone at that time, right? It was before the smartphone. So it was pretty cool, although the father did get a little annoyed, I guess, because one of the girls there, I don't think it was one of the daughters, it was maybe one of the guy's wives, and he didn't mind. I took a picture of her. She looked kind of like Russian or something. She had this really light, pretty blue eyes, and afterwards he, told me to delete it. And so I did, obviously, no big deal. Yeah, so the next day I had breakfast and took off, and there were some nice blue skies, which was nice because I did that trip in December, and I'm not sure if it's like the rainy season, but even in Iraq, you think of the Middle East is always hot, but up in the high mountains there in December, it's still pretty cold. I mean, I'd just been through Turkey in, like November, and there was definitely some snow, so definitely cool that time of year. So yeah, it was nice to have some blue skies and see some really nice scenery over the next day or two before I got to Erbil. I'd stopped in one internet cafe, and as you can imagine, the internet at this time was super slow. And I told the guy I was a tourist, and so it was pretty funny because, he's like, oh, what are you doing here? And I'm going through and stuff, and I'm typing real fast. And obviously I can't hear the local language, understand what they're saying, but he's kind of, as he walked out, he's like, CIA. So it's kind of funny. And then later that day, I came up to a village again, and the local people took me in, which was cool. So the next day I came into a smaller town. I don't think I was in Erbil yet. And I had to fix my spoke, so I stopped at a shop. And in the time that I was fixing the spoke, the guy actually skinned a goat, basically, and ended up barbecuing it. And I hung out there a little bit. And nice guy and everything. I did have a beer, and he was a little annoyed by that because, obviously in some areas it's like, it's halal, like his shop or that area. So he didn't want me drinking, but no big deal. Actually, I could have stayed with him. It wasn't super clean in there. And then some guy said I could stay down the road. So I actually ended up going up to a checkpoint, and I stayed with some military guys that evening. And so that was pretty cool. And the next day, I guess I was going to go check out a waterfall, but it was so rainy and misty, I figured it wasn't even going to be worth it. So then I headed into Erbil, which is like 1.6 million. And so there's quite a bit to do there. And I looked around for hotels, and I got a place for, I don't know, like $20. And, I was even talking to people, like, because I knew that there was some jobs teaching English and different things. I was just kind of curious. And, even the guy at the hotel was so nice. He's like, hey, if you do look for jobs, you can stay here as long as you want for free until you find something. So I thought that was really cool. But I only had like 10 days on that visa or whatever, and I did actually consider extending it and kind of hanging out there for a little bit, but I'd really just started this trip in Armenia a few weeks before, so I wanted to at least finish the Middle East or something before I'd consider stopping for a while. But I have heard of people working there. I've had a friend work there, and I read into it, and I guess it is a pretty decent spot to teach English. So I guess I checked out some of the sites around the city for like a day or two, and then I wanted to get out of the country before that 10 days were up. Basically, the closest way back is to go through Mosul and back up to Turkey. I would have even gone straight to Syria from Iraq, but I don't think you could get through that border. I had to go through Turkey regardless, which makes sense. There's quite a lot of tension around that area. And I wasn't going to go, bike back the same route I just did for a week. And so I arranged a taxi. And of course, we had to make sure that it wasn't going to go directly through Mosul because that's the main road. We wanted to go around because there was still quite a lot of bombings and things like that in Mosul. And so I guess I negotiated for like $50 and stuff, and it was me and a couple other Kurdish guys or whatever, and maybe a guy from Turkey. And so yeah, we were even kind of nervous because it was like I was checking the map because I didn't have a phone with GPS, but I'm looking at the signs, and I could see Mosul, and I'm kind of like, we're going around. And even the Kurdish guy, the older guy, he was kind of goofy because he was talking the whole time, and obviously I can't understand what they're saying, but pretty animated character and pretty funny. But I could tell he was concerned. He's like, no, we don't want to go through Mosul, and neither did I. And luckily, I guess, only within 10 miles, we had gone, around, did a small detour on some small roads, and we did see some areas that were bombed out. And so right as we get to the border, I had seen, I don't remember at which point he did this, but he had a bunch of cartons of cigarettes, right? And he put them back in the trunk. And I'm not sure if I was aware if he put them into my luggage or not. You know, I have my panniers, which are pretty open generally. And yeah, he put basically some cartons of cigarettes in my bags. And I've seen Midnight Express. If you don't know Midnight Express, it's a movie about an American guy goes to Turkey and gets busted with hash and does like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years in prison. It's like one of the most horrifying movies you'll ever see. And so obviously, I'm not going to confess that those are mine. Of course not, because I don't even if they're just cigarettes, I don't want to pay a fine. And I think they were allowed like 3 each. So he had like 4 over and had to spend like $90 or something. And of course, he's annoyed at me for not saying it's mine. I'm like, sorry, dude. I have no idea what the laws are, but I'm not claiming, you know, something that's not mine. And so he's obviously annoyed about that. And then, you know, the agreement was for me to basically go to the Turkish town there. But one of the guys was late to get to the airport. So he ended up having to take that guy there first, which would have been out of the way. And then he wanted me to basically pay extra to go back to that town because he would be missing out on, I don't know, maybe picking up someone from the airport or whatever. And so, yeah, it was a big argument and this kind of stuff. It's always difficult with cab drivers. But I ended up getting to that town anyway. And then, yeah, I was only in Turkey for a few days before I went back into Syria, which will be my next video. And I don't have too much to say about that part in Turkey, although I did stay with like some couch surfers and stuff in Gaziantep, which is an old like historical town next to Syria. And the Italian kid I was walking with, I'm not sure if he was kind of like a vocal critic of like, you know, the regime in Turkey at the time, or whatever he did. I don't know what he did, but we were walking down the street at night after we had some drinks at somewhere and dinner or whatever. And someone came up in an SUV and whacked him in the back of the head. And so it was kind of crazy and just took off. We were like, what the hell was that? And yeah, so a little bit of a surprise there. Another reason why I was like, Turkey was a little bit weird to me. Overall, it was also a good experience. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video about Iraq. And I'll have my story of Syria next. So I'll see you later. So guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more content. My channel has a lot of different stuff from my travels around the world, whether hiking or biking, and some of the things over the years I've done, whether I was in the military, commercial fishing in Alaska, or my experience living in China and Taiwan for 15 years. And I was a teacher there and led tours and did all kinds of stuff. So if that stuff's beneficial for you or entertaining, subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.